and the places that you know seem like fantasy. There's a light inside your soul that's still shining in the cold, with the truth, the promise in our hearts. Don't forget, I'm with you in the dark.
Mrs. Kindly lives in a cottage by the railway. Mrs. Kindly loves trains and waves when they go by. Once, when she was ill in bed, she saved Thomas from an accident. The Fat Controller sent her to Bournemouth to get well. Thomas and Toby missed her greatly and looked forward to welcoming her home again. Thomas had never forgotten how she had saved him from an accident and always wanted to thank her properly. Toby agreed with him, and so did their drivers and firemen.
Let's give her a party at Christmas,
they said.
But
where can we hold it? They wondered. Our shed's much too small. There's no room for anyone else when we're inside. But Thomas's driver wouldn't give up. Let's try Tidmouth, they said. I'm sure the big engines would like a party in their grand new shed. We'll ask them when we go there tonight. The big engines were delighted, and so were their drivers and firemen. We'd like that, they said. A party would be fun. We'll ask the Fat Controller tomorrow. A party for Mrs. Kindly, said the Fat Controller. What a good idea of Thomas. Let me see. We've no trains on Christmas or Boxing Day. We all want Christmas at home, of course. So Boxing Day would be best. So they made an invitation card.
as the engines were decorating the outside of the sheds, the Fat Controller came driving in. Mrs. Kindly is covered up with snow. Thomas and Toby, I need your help to save her. The next morning, Thomas and Toby collected workmen. They set off to save the Kindleys. They plowed through heavy amounts of snow, and if they couldn't, the crew helped them plow it. They soon arrived at Miss Kindly's house and found a blanket of snow covering the rails. Once men started working on it, Thomas noticed a friend. It was Terence. While Terence and some men worked on the Kindly's cottage, Thomas and Toby and the others worked on the branch line until there was enough snow to be cleared. Meanwhile, Percy had gotten Henrietta, who was being cleaned up, the coach and once they collected the Kindleys, Thomas and Toby swapped their coach with Henrietta, and the three set off. When Thomas and the others got back at Tidmouth Sheds that night, it seemed pitch black and dark. But suddenly, "What a marvelous sight," said Thomas. All the lights came on, and a grand sight of their friends appeared before them. The Fat Controller showed off Mr. and Mrs. Kindly to the guests. Edward, Gordon, and Henry were astounded to meet Mrs. Kindly. "They're not the Queen and King," said James. Mrs. Kindly then turned to Percy.
"Thomas and Toby are old friends. And now, Percy, you are my friend, too."
"Three cheers for Mrs. Kindly," said Percy. Before the party began, the Fat Controller had an announcement. "I'd like to give Mr. and Mrs. Kindly free travel tickets across the entire island." One winter evening, Thomas and Duck were at Tidmouth Sheds when Duck asked the question. "Thomas, you never told me about the time Miss Kindly saved you from a landslide. Whatever happened?" asked Duck. Thomas politely responded, "All right, I'll tell you." One rainy December day, Thomas was puffing down the line to see Mrs. Kindly. He was just going nicely when his driver noticed something in the distance. Near Mrs. Kindly's cottage was a red dress waving from her window. "You better stop, men," said Thomas's driver. "Mrs. Connolly might be in trouble." Thomas's driver stopped Thomas calmly nearby the house. "See if there's a doctor on board," said the fireman, as he went to look up the line. 2 other passengers went to see Mrs. Kindly. Then the fireman came back. "We should head back to the station and get a good starting for Thomas," said the driver. "There's no point in doing that," said the fireman. "Just look up the line. I wouldn't be able to get through anyway." The driver looked up the line, and there was a massive landslide. "Oh, Jiminy Christmas," he said. "I think Mrs. Connolly was trying to warn us." Thomas's driver went to see Mrs. Connolly, but a doctor was waiting for her. "It was silly of me to faint," said Mrs. Connolly. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, ma'am," said Thomas's driver. "You saved our lives. Without you, we would have crashed into the landslide. Who knows how many people would have been hurt?" "God bless you, ma'am," said Thomas's driver, happily. They cleared the line by Christmas Day, and Toby, Thomas, Annie, Clerval, and Henrietta with the fat controller all came to see Mrs. Kindly. "I am very happy with you, Mrs. Kindly," said the fat controller. "As a reward for helping us, I shall give you and your husband 2 tickets to Bournemouth, a VIP type ticket." "Thank you, sir," said Mrs. Kindly happily. As they made their way downstairs, Thomas, Toby, the coaches, and the passengers all sang carols for Mrs. Kindly and her husband. Mrs. Kindly and her husband had a wonderful time at Bournemouth, and Thomas and Toby could not wait for them to get back. Autumn had come to the island of Sodor. The leaves were falling, the trees were shedding, and a small little orange tractor plowed through the field. One day, Thomas and his coaches saw this tractor while pulling on his line. "Hello," said the tractor. "I'm Terence." "Hello," said Thomas. "I'm Thomas. What ugly wheels you've got." "They're not ugly," said Terence. "They're my caterpillars. I'm able to make tracks among the ground, so I can go anywhere I'd like. I don't need rails to move around." "Well, I like my rails," said Thomas, and he rudely puffed away. From time to time, Thomas would see Terence once in a while, and while he would whistle to Terence, Terence would never respond back. Winter soon came, and Thomas's driver was not happy. "I don't like this," he'd say. "Snow will get worse." But Thomas just thought, "Snow is silly, soft stuff. It can't hurt me." When they arrived at the next station, Thomas saw a snowplow. "Don't tell me," said Thomas. "I'm afraid so," said his driver. "You'll have to wear your snowplow for the next journey." Thomas hated his snowplow. He shook it and banged it, and by the end of the afternoon, it was so banged up, Thomas couldn't fit it on. "You're a very naughty engine," said his driver. Soon, Thomas had to leave without his snowplow. "Be careful, Thomas," said his driver. "It will get deep in the valley." As Thomas puffed down his line, he just thought, "Snow is silly soft stuff. It can't hurt me." He rounded the bend and entered the tunnel, but there was trouble ahead. "Cinders and ashes," thought Thomas. "I'm stuck." And he was. "Pull out," said his driver. Thomas tried to move, but the snow refused to let him go. His crew tried digging away the snow, but there was too much. A bus had to take his passengers away, and poor Thomas was left cold in the snow. But who to come and save him but Terence? I'm very sorry I was rude to you, said Thomas. That's all right, said Terence. Let's be friends. All right, said Thomas, and Thomas, with his 2 coaches, puffed away with a brand new friend. There is a small part of Thomas and Percy's branch line where they pass a small village in a valley. One December morning, Thomas told the others, "It's nearly Christmas, but I'll be back to deliver you all some presents." But that night, a couple days later, a heavy snowstorm came. By morning, Sodor was covered in a blanket of snow. The rails became very slippery, and engines had trouble getting from place to place. One day, Thomas and Percy were waiting near the station. "I'm excited to deliver the parcels to the people at the village," said Thomas. But Percy was sad. "I won't be able to do any of that." But Percy's luck changed for the better. "Thomas, we need you at the yard," said the yard manager. "Percy, you will take the parcels." "But I won't be able to deliver presents," said Thomas sadly. "Don't worry, Thomas," said Percy. "I'll say they're from you." Percy puffed through the snowy countryside. "What's that on the rails?" said his driver. Ahead was a man with a red flag. "The rails are closed here," he said. "There's too much snow. If you need to pass, you'll need a snowplow, some tractors, and some helpers. Leave your mail trucks on a siding, and go get help." Percy arrived near the airfield to where the helicopter was. "Harold," said Percy, "can you help us? People are stuck in the snow village in the valley." "Certainly." And Harold flew away. Further up the line, Percy was thinking to himself, "Okay, what's next?" Just then, Thomas with his snowplow arrived with Terence and Clarabelle. "Join in, Percy," said Thomas. "We're going to help the villagers." And the 2 engines puffed to the village. Once they finally reached the village, they saw Harold dropping parcels from above. Terence soon got to work to clear the snow. "This is fun stuff," he would say to himself. Once they were finished, the people cheered. "Hooray for Thomas, Terence, and Percy, and Harold. The best Santa Claus we've ever had." Percy was puzzled. "What's a Santa Claus?" "Santa Claus," said Thomas, "is a fat guy who goes down chimneys to give presents to people." "You mean—" "No, Percy, not through your funnel, just chimneys. But that reminds me, Percy, you still have your mail trucks to deliver." And Percy puffed away. Just then, Toby arrived with Henrietta. "We've brought hot cocoa and parcels." That night, Toby stayed at the village to help the others with a surprise for the engines. Once they arrived at Timid's sheds, Toby didn't know what they were going to do. That morning, the engines were amazed to see their sheds decorated, parcels everywhere, and streamers from above. They knew this was a truly Merry Christmas. Brandon Docks is an important part of the island of Sodor. Many engines collect their cargo from here to take all over the island, dropped off by ships and other transportation vehicles. There is an important train here that carries fish across the island. This is the train the railwaymen like to call the Flying Kipper. One winter evening, Henry's driver said, "We'll be out early tomorrow, Henry. You've got to take the Flying Kipper. That Welsh coal will help you nicely." He smiled with glee. Henry arrived the next morning. There was snow and frost. Men hustled and shouted, filling the vans full of fish. The last door banged. The guard showed his green flag, and the flying kipper was ready to go. As Henry puffed down the line with the flying kipper, neither he nor his crew noticed the points had been diverted and frozen to another line. Down that line, a goods train pulled by James was resting in a siding. "The flying kippers do," said the brake van man. "Who cares?" said the guard. "This is good cocoa." While the men chatted about something, they didn't notice Henry and his crew puffing down that same line towards them. They would not get out in time. Henry's driver and fireman jumped clear before the crash, but Henry lay bruised and battered in the snow. Soon later, the VAT controller came with the breakdown train. "Cheer up, Henry," he said. "This wasn't your fault. Ice and snow caused the accident. I'm sending you to Crew, a fine place for sick engines. They'll give you a new shape and a larger firebox. You'll feel a different engine, and you won't need special coal anymore. Won't that be nice?" "Oh, yes, sir," said Henry doubtfully. When spring arose soon after, Henry returned to the Sodor. Henry had a new shape and a larger firebox. A crowd of people cheered for Henry's return, and Henry pulled the express so well that even Gordon got jealous. But that's another story. One week before Christmas, a diesel from the other railway collects a tree for Thomas and his friend on the island of Sodor for Christmas. 1 week before Christmas, however, Thomas came to see the VAT controller at the station. "Now, Thomas," he said, "I'd like you to collect the Christmas tree from the works. Gordon will take the mare of Sodor, and Henry will take the partridges." "Will we be able to sing, sir?" said Thomas excitedly. "We'll see." 2 days before Christmas, the VAT controller came to see Thomas at his shed. "The tree is all ready for you to collect, Thomas," he said, and Thomas puffed away. But at the bigger sheds, Gordon and Henry were complaining. "Oh, it's ridiculous! It's ridiculous!" said Gordon, upset. "Thomas gets to carry a tree? Oh, it's not fair. I know. Oh, a tree! He gets to carry the best thing." Donald and Douglas were annoyed. "It's a Christmas tree," said Donald. "Why is it so important to you? Gordon, you're taking the mare, and Henry, you're taking the parcels." "Oh, it's no Christmas tree, though." But the next day, Thomas had not arrived. The engines were wondering where Thomas was. "Perhaps he got stuck in the hills," thought Gordon. No, said Henry. "He got on the wrong line." The VAT controller came just as it started to snow. "Thomas left the work safely," he said, "but we cannot find him. I need 2 engines to help look for him." We'll do it, Gordon and Henry said. "You two have jobs. Do them. Besides, Donald and Douglas are better snow prepared than you two, so I'll send them instead." Getting ready, Donald and Douglas went on the search for Thomas. As they puffed for Thomas, they saw Duck, Toby, and Percy puffing the other direction. "All trains are cancelled," said Duck. "We're going to the big station," said Toby. The twins puffed vigorously through the heavy snow. "I think I need to rest my wheels," said Donald. "No, we must find Thomas," said Douglas. The snow got harder and harder to push, but the Scottish twins didn't care. At last, they came across something in the snow. It was Thomas. Turn the camera around. By the time Donald and Douglas had found Thomas, he was already being shoveled out of the snow by other workmen. Luckily, an hour later, James and Edward came to help, and the 5 engines puffed back to the station. That night, all the engines arrived at the station, where the lights shone nicely. "Who are you?" said Percy to a new character. "Find out in season 3. I'll be ready, men. 1, 2, 3. The light shone all over the station. Soon, a gust of air blew nearby. It was Harold, bringing the biggest surprise of them all, Old Father Christmas. He thanked James nicely for his hard work. "We literally did more than he did," complained Douglas. "You know, Percy," said Thomas, "it's not fun getting stuck in the snow, but I'd rather be out here with my friends than in there. Merry Christmas, Percy, and Merry Christmas, everyone."